Well, thank you everyone for coming here in attendance, and to those of you in cyberspace that are logged on. So that's it, my title. So a few prerequisites is to be aware that most of this stuff comes from Wikipedia. So my annual $100 contribution to them is well rewarded by all the information there. Something called boardgamegeek.com, which I'm a member of, and that's free. You just sign up. And I own another games game, okay. And when this idea was first put into my mind, I mentioned that any board game service could be considered as a map, but that just opens the floodgates. Because you could say, oh, well, Foursquare is a map, right? I didn't want it just way too much. So, plus there are, I say a generally accepted definition of a map, because you can create imaginary maps and work with that and have all kinds of games, but I try to, there's too much of that stuff, okay? So thank you, Jim, for suggesting the topic. And again, I know nothing. All right, so in our original brochure, we talked about the game of Risk, because that was the first board game that I played that involved a map. So some of you, this might look familiar. And I think in the one of the description, that's the first time I ever heard of Yakutsk and Irkutsk. Not knowing that those were actually cities, but on here, those were territories. All the other names I've heard of before, because I was already into maps since first grade. So I got into a little bit, what is the history of this game? And as you can see, it came from a French filmmaker, Albert Emmanuel Lamouris, called La Conquête du Monde. And in '57, and 2 years later, Parker Brothers took it over. And they then, of course, commercialized it and made lots of money. And hopefully so did Albert Emmanuel. Yes?
Can we ask questions, or you want to wait till the end?
Might as well do it now.
I was going to ask, has the map in Risk changed since 1959?
Well,
or is it the
let's
same?
take a look. This is the original map. I can't get a better image than this. This is off the internet. But that reasonably looks like the current game. Not a whole lot has changed, actually. Even the territorial, what do you call it?
Boundaries.
The boundaries and the territories are different, but they closely relate to current game. Here is a map, an Italian version of it, because you can say La Conquête du Monde revised, but the names like Brazil and Australia Orientale and Occident, those are the Italian things. The only difference here is that there is a link from here to here, which is not in the original version, nor in the current version. So that's the only big discrepancy I could find. So I'll also be talking about terms like diplomacy and tactics and strategy, because that's what these games involve. So first we talk about the game of diplomacy, a board game that was created in 1954. Can we get rid of that somehow? Is there a way to get rid of my name up there? Because it's covering up some of my text. I didn't realize it was going to be there the whole time. Or just minimum. That's good enough. Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so there's a game called Diplomacy. And first one is negotiation, where the players spend most of the time forming and betraying alliances with other players and agreeing upon beneficial strategies. Welcome to the modern world. It's even applicable today, right? We form our alliances and then we betray them and try to make it to our own advantage. And the fact that there's no dice involved in this game. So everything is dependent on talking with each other and trying to form alliances, etc., and stabbing somebody in the back. So it was leading to the First World War and the forces of the European powers. So this was back in 1954. And this was the map that is used at that time, which is reasonably accurate. And it has a lot of redundant information because in this game, it doesn't matter whether you cross mountains or flat land, it's all one move. So the actual, the heights of things, even though there's a oh, here's where my pointer goes. So even though it tells you and the depths, it's totally irrelevant to actually playing the game. You just move from one territory to another, which is in the various black outlines. Then we have a game called Tactics. And before 1950, all we had were sets of rules, how to play a game. Nobody provided you the equipment or the map for that. So this company called Avalon Hill believed that there was a market for these things, because otherwise you would have to come up with your own map and you'd have to come up with your own pieces to play on the map. So they kind of commercialized this in the form of cardboard counters, as well as rules and a box to hold everything. And that was a game that was similar to other war games published in English in England and elsewhere over the previous half century. But these were not for the mass market. So this was back in 1954, where the first commercially successful war game was developed. And this is called Tactics. And this is one of those imaginary maps, but I'm just using it again to prove that, you know, this is where the concept came from. So here are the blue forces, and here are the pink forces. And then they have this territory that they have to go through, mountains here. Obviously, the darker blue is water, so you can't traverse that. And this was the game that you would play. And there's also a game called Stratego. You could say, well, that's strategy, but it doesn't really, it's played on a 10-inch square grid and, oh yeah, L'attaque in 1909 even, they started with this. So. But other than that, there's no game called strategy that I found. So we get into this whole thing about wargaming, because that's really where this whole board game concept came from, which was invented in Prussia back in the 18th century. And the earliest war games were based on chess. And you could call that a war game because of the different pieces and you're attacking each other and all that. So
it's played on a grid.
And played on a grid, right? So it's not really a map in that sense, but which is why I don't really cover it too much. But the concept of having these quote military units, you know, you have your kings and your rooks and etc. So and the squares were color coded to present different types of terrain, and officially in 1824, the Prussian army adopted that as a training tool. Yes, sir.
How do you make it a difference between a grid versus a map? What's the kind of?
Well, it's really the underlying what's there that would be the map part. And you will see there are grids that has to be imposed on it in most cases so that you know where to move.
So when you say the delineation is like meters, or is it just like in general?
Well, as the arts of gaming has proceeded, you need to have places, like back in the diplomacy, they were those black areas, right? Those were the territories. And that worked well for that type of game. For other games where you have troops and units attacking each other, you needed a little bit more room, I guess, like chopping it up into some type of a grid that would work. I think that's the best I can say.
Thank you.
Sure. So a war game is a strategy game that attempts to realistically represent warfare. So there's this one game called Little Wars. And you may have seen this where people play with boy soldiers and stuff like that. So they bring their own, you bring your own parts, your troops, your cannon, horses, whatnot. And then you follow and he has a book that describes the rules. And you would determine, for instance, the line of sight as well as the distance with a measuring tape, because the further you have to shoot away, the less you're likely to have a hit. And then there is a judge who makes the decision what those things are. So you have two people playing and you need one judge to tell you, yeah, you hit them and you killed one of them. And the other person, you might say, yeah, you hit them and you killed three of them, or you missed altogether. Yes, sir.
Where did you find this illustration?
Off the net.
Nice.
Yes. I really went looking at, the earliest games, that board games. Oops, that's the wrong one. There we go. Pardon me? Sorry, I didn't.
You know if it exists anymore.
Does it exist anymore?
Those
Okay.
kind of games with
It
3D
still exists.
soldiers.
Yeah, you see that. Hang on. So here's the set of rules with toy soldiers written by H.G. Wells, and here's the full title. A game for boys from 12 years of age to 150. I think I have about 8 more years to go to be halfway. So looking forward to that. And then it's downhill from there, if it isn't already. And the more intelligent sort of girl. Ladies. And as an aside, Dungeons and Dragons in 1974 was derived from these types of toy figures initially. Now it's all over the map, and everything is now computer generated also, even with Dungeons and Dragons. So here's an example of that. So you could so here, somebody had a, I don't know, bathroom floor or entryway or the kitchen tile system and put the game on that, right? So here you get your square pieces because, hey, that's convenient and you happen to have it with you. And so you've got your little toy soldiers, etc. And it looks like some of these didn't quite make it, but neither did that guy and that guy. And then you put these sheets of blue down to show water. So you can't go across them, but maybe you can shoot it. I don't know. Yeah, whatever the rules are, you need to have H.G. Wells' rule book, right? You provide the rest. So a little bit more about strategy, because it's a game in which the player's outcome decision-making skills are highly significant in determining the outcome. And that's what we call a tree-style thinking. If I do this, he or she might do that, and then I have to counteract that somehow, which is the way chess is played, basically. It's just a question of how many levels deep can you hold and remember and decide to protect against. So these have been played quite a bit since 3500 BC. They found these parts. They don't have the rules. They never found the rules. So you can kind of make and do with that. So if you consider this a board game, which I had in my original thing, but it's really not a map. So, but I just want it there for historical reference to see how long these things have been around. And backgammon, 5,000 years ago, royal game of Ur from Mesopotamia, these other games, and even the ancient Aztecs had their version of a game. Kind of interesting that certainly there was no talking between the Aztecs and the people in Ur. So it's just nice to see that people have come up with these things independent, and in China too, of course. Pardon me? Hmm?
Backgammon, a war game sorts?
No, these are just strategy games, basically strategy games. Yeah. But they all provide the foundation that ultimately leads to war games. Okay, so now we're going to get to an actual map. And this is the earliest one I was able to find, called the Traveler's Tour Through the United States, US around 1822. And you couldn't use dice, so you had to use a spinner, because dice are evil. Okay. And there were 139 communities on this. So depending on how you roll, yes,
Sorry, can you just tell me what a spinner is?
a spinner?
Like is it like
Yeah,
a?
just
pendulum
a
or-
an arrow, and you spin it and it points to different values, right? Yeah, that tells you how far you can move or lose your turn or
There you go.
win the prize. I don't know. So there's 139 of them. And you have to name its place. And if you're real advanced, you have to give it its population back in 1822. So this also turned out to be the first game that was published in the US, actually published here and created. So it was also invented in the US rather than being a copy of a British game. So, and this is the actual map, which looks like a reasonable rendition of what the US might have looked like in 1822. However, the map itself, I tried to see if there was, if this was copied from somebody else, and I was unable to determine that. So, but the fact that here it says it's by, this published by F&R Lockwood, and I looked that up, and whoever that person is did not, to my knowledge, produce other maps that were not game related. So it's kind of interesting that was done. And so you can see these are the paths then that you would have to traverse all the way. As you can see, we come up here from Detroit up to here. Lo and behold, Chicago was not quite significant enough back then, but certainly Green Bay is, and La Crosse and all the other places. Or Prairie du Chien, that's probably Prairie du Chien over here, right? Yeah, because here's the river, Wisconsin, presumably, that then empties into the Mississippi. So, and finally you end up at Louisiana, 139. And what's the population then? 10,000, yeah, good. But how about all these other places? No idea. You'd have to know a lot. Okay, so there's another one called A Tour Through the British Colonies, different publisher, around 1850 by John Betts of London. And it kind of got into this, if you look at the original, that 1822 map, it was kind of a way to get people to learn geography, or in this case, the names of places and their populations. So in this tour, you go through a colonial experience of the world, again, a spinner, moving from part, and then you read an educational paragraph about the colonial possession that you landed on. So some of these, quote, games were not just to entertain you, but also something you would learn from. And there's a whole series of games or maps that do that. So this was like and I call them cartouches because they sure look like them. So so you would go to these different places and read something about them for family fun night. So there are other games that go into this kind of genre of fun with a map and learning something. And some of these are called trekking games, trekking the world, trekking a national park, a game called Outdoor Survival, and many others. So you go and travel around. And there's this one called Trekking the World, for example. I've never played it, but I can kind of think I know what's involved. you have to move around and
What's the object of this game?
to win, as with every game.
How do you?
How do you win? Yeah, how do you win?
Well, I never played it, but like most of these games, you collect points along the way and whoever gets at the end gets the most.
Your win.
But, you know, this is kind of a geographical slash historical things in history that happened. So you've got the Milford Sound, you've got Angkor Wat, you have the Taj Mahal, Cappadocia. You remember that name? You've got Angel Falls, you've got Grand Canyon, etc. So they're all different places, and presumably you then get a card that tells you something about those places. Another one, trekking the national parks. And you can see where you start, and you go to all these different national parks. Those are not all of them, by the way. My wife and I have probably done about half, 40 or so of the 95 or whatever that are now around. But the other thing is you find that sometimes although it's a map, there is some distortion because you have to try to fit all this onto this rectangular board. So here, Wisconsin is a little bit distorted. It's not quite the way we look at it. This should be much more sticking out, Door County. But that I think is just a given with you, the map developer, where you have to try to cram all this information on there. Even though the original concept is a map, you're going to have to make little adjustments so it will all fit. Yes. What, Rich?
The start place. Start.
I'd say it's right there.
Like this.
That's my guess. Sorry.
So,
And again, you move around. Obviously, the goal is to try to get to every single national park. If you were the first one to achieve, presumably you put a little piece on there to say, I was there first. And then you go on to everywhere else. And so everybody's vying to cover as much territory as you can. Yes. Have not. No. Yeah. But it's not on my map. It's right up there. But I can't go there because it's not on my map. Yeah. And here you actually start with a blank table. And you pick up these pieces when it's your turn. And you create the map. I have the game, but I've never played it because it's hard to play against yourself sometimes. So.
I have them too, Wilbert, we can do it.
Oh, you do? Oh, okay. All right. Maybe you can get some of the others to join us in that. Okay. So we've already seen Avalon Hill produce some of these games. Then slowly things get more complex. And this one game in 1974, which was the first of its kind, called The Rise and Decline of the Third Reich. And rather than just two people fighting each other, or three or four, it had other attributes to it. There was the economics of war, diplomacy, strategic warfare, randomness, and players requiring certain ability, units, etc. So each playing of the game could have a different outcome. There's no set way to guarantee that you'll win, which is good. Throw some randomness in there so you can't always dominate things. So this was the original map. Here, you'll see that we are now, to facilitate pieces moving around, it's called hexagons, as opposed to squares.
Just an example of hexes, or you know what
This is one of the first ones that uses a hexagon that I'm aware of. Yes. So here's the entire European theater. Things that are south of the red line is the southern front. East of the red line up there is the eastern front, and obviously that's the western front. So, and then you go off at it. And so, for instance, here's an example of the German forces in black, the English forces in orange, and the French forces there. And you'll see that we're about to repeat Dunkirk perhaps here. But it's a strategic point to, when you actually play the game, to try to fend off the Germans from coming down towards Paris that way. Yes, sir.
Is this a pre or post-war game made? This is like a 1950s or 19?
No, this was 1974 is when they came up with this. So. And these kinds of symbols, by the way, is what the military is a kind of a military standard to denote infantry and where else? Armored vehicles, airplanes, etc., air forces. So this has been used by the military, perhaps since the Prussians got involved with this.
So I'm just curious, in that particular war game, could you change D-Day so that it happened in Italy instead of in?
Absolutely, yes. Whatever you think is the winning strategy in this game, if you are representing whoever's going to attack Italy, yes. As a matter of fact, marked in here in these shaded, whoops, where am I? These are called beachheads. So these are places where you could invade a country all along here. That's why it's well defended. So you could go to these different places and use your forces there. Same goes for the Allies, same goes for the Germans. As a matter of fact, yeah, of course, they have to get over to Norway. So those are the beachheads that the only one that they could use. Or and that one up there. So, yes. I mean, once the gates are unleashed, it could develop into whatever you and the other players.
Is there a time limit or something?
There is a time limit. I think the game officially ends around the year, I think 1946.
Well, but I mean, to play.
Oh,
Could they go
no.
For days or?
Oh, these can go on quite a bit because the first thing you've got to learn is the rules. And I can assure you the rules are not always simple. Okay? It can easily take you 2 or 3 days just to digest the rules, practice it to try really see how do you interpret these rules and do they work? Yes, sir.
In this game in particular, did it limit itself to Europe or was it North Africa included?
Yes, North Africa is down here. Here's the overall, right? That was the first slide. So you are, beyond that, you can't go anywhere else. But there is another game similar to this about the Pacific theater. And then there's another one called World at War, which is the whole shebang, everything included, okay? Can you repeat it?
The Pacific Theater game that you mentioned, was this attached to this franchise or was this an independent game?
No, that was also done. Well, I don't know who came out with the Pacific game, but
The first version was out.
was it also Avalon Hill? Okay, the first version was Avalon Hill for the Pacific Theater.
Avalon Hill?
Yes, this is from Avalon Hill. They were the ones that did this one. Okay, then there's this new concept of what are called card-driven games, so that's in 1993. And there was this game called We the People, talking about the Revolutionary War. So now we get rid of any kind of a grid. Okay, but we do have, oh, there we went. But we have just line connections between spaces, much like we had with the national parks thing, right? That you just have different pathways. It wasn't very much a grid, but these were the only ways to get from one point to another. So, but these card-driven games, each turn or set of turns, you grab a bunch of cards, and then you go and play them all out, each one in sequence until you're completely out of cards, and then you gather another set of cards. And these allow you to do some of these additional things that make sense to that game. So when you're next to, for instance, to an opponent, having a spy tell you exactly what forces are there, it could be good information to have. Unless they have a card that says, this is the anti-spy card and we captured your spy, which is a possibility. And those are the chances you take, as in any normal war, right? You don't know what your opponent has, and the opponent doesn't know what you have. And you try to be as sly about it as you possibly can. So this was the setup of that game. Here is Gates and Lafayette. And I couldn't quite make out this guy, but I know he's British. Yeah, red coats, right. And then as you move around and you stay on a territory, then you can mark it. Those are my places, and this is where the English have been. And those markers are important for instance, if you happen to be there and they attack you, it strengthens your defense. Whereas if you go over, if you go over here and are attacked and you haven't conquered it yet, then that's against you. So it's a way to establish that. So those are war-driven, card-driven games. And here is one called Successors. Again, where you have the different connections. And Successors is the battle for Alexander's empire after Alexander dies. So now suddenly all his key generals spread throughout his empire say to themselves, I want to be the next Alexander, and I'm going to go for it. And that's the whole concept of this game. So you try to fight off the other generals and try to take over. One thing about these types of games, you can see this spreads all the way from Cyrene and Greece, nowadays Greece, to Persia and everything in between. And here, what amazes me is that we're just playing a game. But the designers of this game went through the effort of finding all these different old communities. There's Cappadocia again. So it was around back then, and it's still around today in the traveling the world game. So, I mean, you have to do a lot of research because I don't think there's a single map that covers all of this territory. You may find one map previously created that just covers this area, and maybe another one that covers this area, but to put it all together into one huge thing, you have to do some research. And it's just a game, but some people really go to all out to make it as realistic as possible. And you have other games like that nature also. So here's a close-up of some of these different names. Like I never heard of Syllabus before, or Sapara, or Arbella, etc. Other names might be okay. Here's Armenica, part of Armenia, what is now Armenia, etc. And many of these games now are done on computers, and many are created on computers. So you don't always have to have a board game to do this. You can do all this all by yourself, back at home at 3 a.m. and go and have at it. But in my opinion, there's nothing like the camaraderie with a bunch of people getting together and playing a game. There's a lot of social interaction and razzing each other and whatnot, and that's all part of the fun. Okay, minimalist war game map, because this is the Battle of Lepanto, and there are no place names on there. It's a sea battle. And if it wasn't for this, whoops, sorry, wrong button. If it wasn't for this could be anywhere. The only thing that this does is prevent some ships from going too much to the right. Otherwise, it's wide open, but I think once you get off the map, that's too bad, you're lost. So this is actually a recreation of the famous battle of the Christian forces at the north and the Ottoman forces at the south. And this was a major sea battle that even though the Christians were outnumbered in units, and these are all done with the different admirals, as with here. So this is the initial setup for this. That's all that's for. And from then on, it's just wide open sea. As it turned out, the Christians won because they had some more powerful ships. They had a lot more ships, but they were weak in that sense. Okay, and then I'm getting into a few topical areas like railroad games. And there's lots others. I only have so much time. I don't even know what time it is. Anyway, so back in the early 1960s, you have a game, whoops, sorry. Trying to go back, nope. Okay, sorry. So we started this game looking to create a game with friends. First came up with the idea of a railway and stock market game called Mainline. It had a generic map. He felt it lacked a touch of reality and placed it onto the map of southern England. And finally, it was published in 1829. That was the name of the game in 1974. So this was the start of railroading in England. By the mid-1980s, Tresham began to license the concept of stocks and railways game to other companies. And the first one was called 1830, Railroads and Robber Barons, which is when the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad first started. That was the first commercial railroad in the US. And then from that on, of course, everybody else went on the bandwagon. So he was still involved in it. And so he licensed it, and they are called 18XX for the different years. But then after a while, you run out of years. So then there's 18 Scan for Scandinavia. There's 18 Mex for Mexico, et cetera. So there's all these other derivatives that have spun off of this. Right now, we have over 250 of them.
So you mean there were literally like 250 board games published?
Yes. Yes.
With pieces and boxes and.
Yep.
Whew.
Yes.
Some of them self-published.
So it's one of these things that kind of takes off with its own life. And here's 1830. And just to give you a slight feel for it, you have Baltimore and Ohio starts here. And from there, the idea is to run trains to different areas, and each of these cities has a value to it. So if you can run a train, you get points or money for that, and you try to dominate everybody else. But meanwhile, you've got the Penn Central there, you've got New York and New Haven, you've got the New York Central, there's the Erie, et cetera, et cetera. And we all go and buy stocks and try to outdo each other. Another version is called Rail Baron in the 1970s under a game called Boxcars. Avalon Hill acquired that and put it on a US map with routes of 28 historical railways, such as, again, the Baltimore and Ohio and the Southern Pacific. And now there's other offshoots for Europe, the UK, Australia, Colorado, the New York subway, et cetera. Again, all these different flavors and versions of it. So this is the real bearing game. And the idea is to, you draw a number, and that tells you, you have to take your, if I happen to be here, you now have to travel all the way to, say, Los Angeles, using different railroads. Unless you happen to own one that happens to follow that exact thing, and then you're good. But these, you buy these railroads, and they can be pretty expensive if it's very, very big territory that it covers. And there's a game called Ticket to Ride, which some of you might be familiar with. That came out in 2004 and has now sold over 10 million copies. So it was a very successful, and it's not as complicated as some of these other games are, which I think is part of the success. Even kids can play that. And here is Ticket to Ride for the United States, which you may or may not have seen. Again, you have that same issue of trying to fit everything on a map. So you can see that Minnesota got a little bit distorted, as well as where Duluth is located. But, and I can see why, because you somehow need to get these 3 straight ones, as well as those 4 and those 6 and those 3. And so you have to somehow find a good middle ground where you can place these. So you're kind of restricted by the way the game works, and having pathways from one city to another, and how many of these pieces you need. Like you need only 2 of these colors to make this connection, whereas here, where was it? Like here you need 6 to make that connection. So those are the trade-offs in game design, which you can do. But it's still a reasonable representation of a map of the United States. Okay. More of me. I don't know where I am in time. Are we close? 10:07. Oh, perfect. And I didn't even know. Great. So I'm also given presentation of the Chicago Map Society's retracing of the auto guide, how to get from Chicago to Lake Geneva. There's the one in McHenry and Wilmette, and copies of our publication will then be available for $15, as well as here. So if anybody's interested,